don't know what we're getting into, and with his hand out there, don't know what we're getting into, but we're going to do something with this.
Wow, that's a good, I like that impression. But yeah, on tonight's episode of What We Found in Dude's Shed, we're going to try and figure out what that chainsaw is. Alright, just what we need. Another derelict saw project. Picked up this thing a while back when I was over at the dude's place, you know, scrounging up some miscellaneous spare parts that I didn't need. And it's one of those remnant model McCullochs that are sort of 80s era, I believe, but when they just went overboard on plastic everywhere. But from what I could find, the motor and mechanicals were still pretty similar to the older style. So the only thing I knew about this saw was it was mostly complete. Didn't have a recoil handle though. The motor does spin. Don't know if it's really got much compression or maybe it's just dry from sitting. We'll find out. Did a quick search on eBay for a recoil, and wow, prices were just insane because there was only like one on there and they wanted $100. Well, that wasn't happening. So the saw got cast into long-term storage until one day a cheap one finally showed up. Finally got this thing into the shop. It's definitely been sitting on the shelf for a while. Might call it Project Purgatory, but it was just waiting for proper funding and parts acquisition. I mean, the elusive recoil, that was key. And as I threw that piece of plastic down there in the box, it kind of occurred to me that that is the story of this entire saw. Just plastic everywhere. And even the parts that are still aluminum were painted to look like plastic. Can't lie. First impression of these saws, they feel kind of weird and kind of weak and cheesy. You just got plastic mold seams everywhere. I mean, everything is plastic. But it is that heavy type of plastic, and you got to admit that it's kind of a unique design that you don't really see much more. There's part of the old saw. That sort of almost muffler. Yeah, this thing's probably going to be heavy, loud, and smoke like a chimney. Just needs some scratch-off tickets for the full combo. Oh yeah. Hey, at least it still has an air filter. Boy, nobody's disturbed that grunge in a while. Went to see if the breather was any good. I think that might have exceeded its life expectancy. Now usually these tanks, well, they smell like a septic tank with the old fuel that's been sitting in there, but this one, it's got a bunch of red heavy oil, and it actually doesn't smell that rank. It's got to be some type of a solid racing motor oil or something. Probably wasn't your run-of-the-mill cheap junk off the dollar store shelf. I gave everything a shot of compressed cleaner. It doesn't look too bad in there. You can definitely tell this is an older saw that's just been spiffed up a little bit. It's got all these crazy linkages and stuff going on inside here, you know, as well as the entire contained carb underneath the air filter. The fuel line is not completely hardened, but it is, you can tell it's shrunk over time. It had a little bit of flexibility left down here in the tank. I'd say this is a case where if you had to run this thing, that would most likely get you through maybe a tank of fuel or a day or two. Sometimes it seems like they'll hold up for a while, and then after the fuel finally soaks back into it, then the fuel lines split, come apart, or basically just dissolve. So if you had to run this thing, probably put fuel in it, run it, and use it, and then bank on it needing another overhaul. Since we're actually planning on going to use this thing, likely going to see if we just can't replace this ahead of time and not have to worry about it for a while. I'd say it's 50-50 on whether the diaphragm's still good in the carb, although from the condition of the oil down in there, there's a good chance that it didn't have ethanol fuel in it. Gonna save that gasket for later. Well, unfortunately, it is a molded fuel line. so we can't just use something off the shelf. Have to see what those cost. Maybe we'll chance it. Preventative maintenance is becoming more and more of an option when you actually have to buy parts. Well, maybe a little bit of scuffing on that piston, but it doesn't look too bad. Huh, didn't realize that the muffler actually was that substantial under there. Maybe they improved it. At least knock off some of the petrified oil and sawdust to get maximum cooling. Well, we had some spark. Well, it's a Walbro, but it's made in Singapore. Carburetor is surprisingly clean. Don't see that very often. Even the diaphragm's still pretty soft. So the oiler pump was jammed and seized all the way in. Couldn't figure out what was going on. Eventually just started wrenching on it. Here it was turned 90 degrees, and the slot there at the bottom, well, it was just binding up on this clip, so should work now. Oh yeah, the mess means it's working. So the carburetor's all back together, and this thing is almost just begging for a test run. I think the plan of attack for the fuel tank is going to be just run this, see if it lasts, and go and get a new part on order. Probably forget about it, remember it once or twice, procrastinate, and then not have the part in stock when it eventually does fail. Oil tank caps are always half cross-threaded. We're going to take the file and try and chase those threads back into shape. Took that spark arrestor out and burned it clean with the propane. It was half clogged, so it's at least, well, usable now. Now, a while back, I was forced to buy like 50 of these little duckbill check valves. Yeah, always helps to have extras on the shelf. Now, at first glance, the chain didn't look that bad. Plenty of life left in the teeth, can sharpen them up. However, after kind of going and just giving it the once-over, well, there's a section that the drive teeth are, well, there's not much left of them. Supposed to be like that. And there's just enough of them that's probably one wrap around the sprocket. Bury that in some oak and she'll probably be spinning. I guess we're going to use it and see if it's good enough for a test run. Just have to keep an eye out for another chain laying around. Alright, bit of a snag on putting the recoil back on. Turns out that those threaded holes are a really odd small size. Went through the entire junk drawer and was able to find one fastener that had the right threads, and it's not even long enough. Really trying to fight the urge to not just jam a few sheet metal screws in there. Actually used the old thread pitch gauge that was in the cheap tap kit, M4 by 0.7. Boy, McCulloch just did not care about ergonomics during this era. There's like sharp edges everywhere that your fingers catch on. You can't even get a good reach to pull on like choke levers and oilers. Just got an old school, non very well marked kill switch hiding back there. A good portion of the anti-vibe system is just the amount of deflection in the handle. I did a little bit of looking at these models and can't really find if they were detuned at all from like the 610s or the 710s or 700, 600 series. This whole thing reminds me of like smog era carburetors. Mexico?
You boys like Mexico?
So this thing's a McCulloch. Well, that was pretty quick getting it all back together. Just waiting on some 4mm bolts now. So apparently Amazon 2-day shipping isn't always a thing anymore, so while we're waiting for bolts here, we're going to transition over to a bonus Mac. Now that chain oiler is definitely working. Now this thing right here, so there's the 450 pack that we only needed 4 out of. But those should do the job. Time to see if this beast will fire up and maybe see how dull and bad that chain is. Boy, I tell you what, this thing is not light. If you get a good workout trying to run this thing all day. Well, see what happens. Where's the electric start at? Alright, we're cheating. Not bad. Hard to believe, but there just happened to be a pile of chains hanging here. Sharpen it up, see what it does. not too shabby. Starting to run out of bar and chain oil there at the end, so didn't cut up the whole log, but this thing's got some pretty decent torque to it. Did a quick sharpening job on that chain, and it started out pretty good, but even there must have been some dirt on that log because you could tell it getting dull. This was part of a package deal of a whole bunch of saws that, well, no one really needs, but you somehow accumulate them. And for some reason, kind of like the micro-sized 10-inch bar on these, might be small enough to just kind of throw in the back of the sled for trail clearing duty. And since the price was right on this thing, you don't really worry about it too much. So that's kind of perfect. Now the motor does turn over, but the recoil is not recoiling, and I'm sure it's going to need a whole bunch of fuel systems going through. So I watched a video online about how to take apart these Mini-Macs. Apparently there's a strategy and sort of an order to how it comes apart. Basically all I got is remove every bolt that you can and then just rip things that way. So there is water coming out of the bar oil, well, containment section over there, and everything else here has tons of sawdust, dirt, probably poison ivy rinds. It reeks of old stale gas and oil. Well, there's no turning back now. It doesn't quite look like it, but these parts actually were cleaned off. Struggled a bit with that fuel filter that was jammed down in there. Thought it was just a small thing. Turns out it's an entire chunk of felt that we were trying to pull through the wrong way. A little bit of a surprise when we pulled the plug out. It actually had some water remnants on it. Now, there was some water in the bar oil tank. Nothing in the gas tank, obviously, other than stale gas. But I wasn't expecting to see some water in here. The motor seemed to roll over smooth, have good compression. Didn't have any signs of H2O intrusion. But there's no rust on the plug, so hopefully there's no rust on the bearings. We'll just mix her rich on the first run and see how it goes. Well, that was pretty easy. We actually have spark just from kind of flicking this thing over by hand. Of course, it's spewing junk out of the cylinder. The carburetor has a piece that goes down underneath the coil. So you got to take the coil off to get the carburetor off. Wow. There's fiber washers and insulators to keep the coil bolts from grounding out on the carburetor. Now, it did occur to me that I didn't even try to get this thing running before it got blown apart into a million pieces. However, if you're actually going to want to make something run reliably, you're going to have to go through it. I'd say that fuel line might be slightly past expiration date. Now, it might be hard to see, but there's actually oil sludge just sitting down in the fuel inlet. Alright, well, now that the stench of rotten fuel is everywhere, you can actually see we got the diaphragm off the carb here. Well, it's still on there. It's actually soft, and I believe it's still good. However, all the stale gas and all the remnants of dried up oil are still there on the inlets. This is probably a case where if you just kept on spraying the old Cosby sauce in her, eventually the new fuel would have worked its way through and it might have actually ran. But since we're in here, at least everything's been going over, and we'll see if anything else needs replaced, clean it up, put it back together. Well, upon further review, that black grunge and tar is so pervasive that it's actually holding up the little flappers for the fuel pump. And that remnant of old nastiness has the needle stuck as well. Whatever petrified mammoth that was in here at one time, it's now solidified. So at this point, we realize that the diaphragms are pretty much toasted. All the fuel lines are bad. everything is gunked up with a whole lot of dinosaur tar. And this was probably a mistake trying to get this thing running. It is almost without fail. The jobs that you think are going to be quick are the ones that end up, well, just dragging on indefinitely. Alright, so you know how sometimes you're in the middle of a project and there's just something that you should never do that'll just crush all momentum and progress that you have. And that is stopping the project and putting it in a box or a bin. You should never do that. That's how basket cases are created. There's absolutely no way that we're going to forget where all these bits and pieces go, like, 1 to 18 months from now. Because sometimes a normal project just isn't challenging enough. You need to kind of forget everything that you learned along the way of disassembly. And since this video likely won't be published by the time that we're on reassembly, well, I believe future me is in for a good time. You don't need parts organization. I've heard that jigsaw puzzles are one of the most satisfying things to solve. Alright, here's a preview. So, didn't even start the procrastination process yet and have already lost that felt fuel filter that goes in the tank. That sounds like a 4-month from now me problem. It is an urban legend that projects go into boxes and never come out. I've never seen that happen, and I don't know of anybody else that's ever happened to. We're just going to get back to this project in like 3 weeks, and we'll be good to go. We'll just set this down out of the way on another... Wait a minute. What's in this box? Is that another chainsaw?